I don't use football jigs hardly at all, so I'll start with that. The differences in, I don't even keep football jigs in my boat. I only bring those whenever I think I'm gonna need them. I'm trying to find their dog. Take 3. So the first time, air conditioner kicked on, had to go inside, cut that off, make sure that don't happen again. Then the second time, the neighbor's hollering for their dog, which is not an issue, but just right the wrong time of the video. But anyways, we're talking about one of my absolute favorite baits, one of the few baits I keep on the front deck all year long. Literally every single day that I go fishing, I have this bait rigged up on the deck, not even in the box, on the deck, and that is a jig. I always have a jig, and a jig is a simple lure because you can get away with one jig for literally all applications. You can pick one head style, get you a few colors of it, and throw it. You can swim it, drag it, skip it, whatever you want to do. Head designs of jigs are extremely overvalued. I've called them skipping a football jig because it was the last green pumpkin jig I had. Tie it on, put a trailer on it, skip it on the docks and catch them. I've called them flipping swim jigs, dragging swim jigs. I mean, it's all relative. The differences in that the head makes is super small. Now, that being said, if I have the right head for the application, if I'm dragging on rocks, I'm going to throw a football jig. If I'm skipping docks, I'm going to use a jig that I deem a good skipping jig. If I'm swimming a jig, I'm going to use a swimming jig because they do have their advantages, but they're super small. And I don't want you to think that you can't get away with mixing and matching. If it's all you got, it's all you got. Most of us don't have the luxury of a company sending us 100 of each type of jigs a year. So we got to pay for them. They're $5 a piece, so we kind of mix and match. Now, I've kind of reined it in some over the past few years. When I was younger, I had tons of different colors, tons of variations, tons of head styles, and I would always cut one off, tie it on. I would have football jigs and green pumpkin blues and green pumpkin orange and green pumpkin purple. And I've started fishing tournaments a lot, and I know you can't tell it by my last couple of months, but I fish a ton of tournaments, and you'll see in 2019. But I don't have time to fish with a green pumpkin blue jig for an hour. They're not biting it, cut it off, put on green pumpkin orange. They're not biting it, cut it off, put on a green pumpkin purple. They're not biting it, cut it off. You see, I don't do that. That's 3 hours wasted. I have a ton of confidence throwing my 2 colors. I pretty much keep 2 colors of every type of jig. If I'm throwing a swim jig, I keep a white one, and I keep a black and blue. If I'm throwing a skipping jig or a casting jig, I keep green pumpkin and black and blue. I don't really variate. You can see my jig box here. And I have a ton of duplicates. Basically, I have a ton of the same exact half-ounce green pumpkins. Have a ton of the same exact 3/8 ounce green pumpkins. And in my truck, when I go to these tournaments, I have boxes of even more. And they're all exactly the same. I just keep enough to get me through a day, usually 2 days worth of tournament days. So I keep it very, very simple. Now, I'm extremely, extremely picky about which jigs I use, and there's a lot of components to a jig, and getting everything to work perfectly will make you land more fish, for sure. I'm a big believer in that. Now, I think that pretty much all jigs will get about the same number of bites in a day. So you put it, you take a $2 black and blue jig from Walmart, then you go get a $8 tungsten jig. I think they're both going to get you close to the same amount of bites. The difference is the landing percentage. Okay, you have to have the weed guard at the right angle. You got to have paint stay on. You got to have a strong hook. You got to have a good hook gap. And I'm going to explain, you got to have a quality skirt. I'm going to explain the differences and good and bad qualities in all these things. So basically, I guess I'll start with weed guard. So you look at this weed guard here. You can see this is I ordered these heads from Tackle Warehouse to put skirts on them myself. You can see there's a decent sized gap between this hook point and this weed guard. That's about the biggest gap I would ever throw a jig with. Because what happens is, if you got a bigger gap than that, you have to visualize the bait in the water. Yeah, if you hit your limb like this, that weed guard is going to push it around like that. But you got to think about when you come up over a limb, your jig lays over. Okay? Now, if that jig lays over, and there's a big gap between that weed guard, it actually can, because the way that a branch is rounded, if this gap is too big, that can get in there. It can roll over on it, and there's enough gap for the limb to push up in there, and you get hung. So if a weed guard's out like this, which I've seen a lot of homemade jigs with weed guards like this, it's going to get hung a ton because it's going to actually roll over and let that thing come up in there. I've probably got some in here like that. Probably some that I've poured there like that. But you can see, this is about the max. That angle right there is about the max I would ever throw a jig. You really want it to be more like this. You want it to be real close. But you need the weed guard to be stout. So that is, a weed guard angle is extremely important. Now, one thing you hear me talk about a lot is hook gap. And I'll show you, this is my skipping jig. Jig I throw a ton. You see that hook point and that line tie. That hook point is literally over a 1/2 inch higher than that line tie. That is a good hook gap. What that means is, when that is in the back of that fish's mouth, as soon as you move it, there's no obstructions. This is going to collapse and it's going to start digging in the back of that fish's throat. If you have a hook like a jig like this, where it's a homemade one, you can see that hook point is almost exactly in line with that line tie. So whenever you set the hook, this is going to rub on the roof of that fish's mouth and literally have to come all the way out the fish's mouth, turn, and then get that hook in. You're going to hook every single fish in the lips when that line tie is in line with that hook point. It's just an obstruction. It's a metal obstruction. You can't, collapse that. That's going to dig in that fish's mouth and run out their lips. So this is a jig. I had to go inside and get it out of an old box. I didn't even know I had it still. I would never throw this jig. It's a great skipping jig. The head design skips well. It's got a good skirt on it, but that hook point is just not usable. So basically, I try to use cross eye. See, this is a cross eye, but it's a bad hook gap. I call it cross eye. You can see how this one is. The line tie is opposite turned crossways of the hook point. I try to use these exclusively for casting. Swim jigs always have the line tie the same angle as the hook point. And the reason for that is, it just keeps everything more streamlined. It comes through the grass better. But you see this one is a swim jig. Look at that hook point, how much higher it is than that line tie. It's got a really good hook gap. It's got a good weed guard angle and a stiff weed guard. I throw this on braid, 50-pound braid, and reel it through grass, and it has absolutely no problems. So the swim jigs I use literally have to be like that. See that hook gap? Huge, very, very important thing. Now, skirts are very, very important because that is what gives you the pulsing action, and that's the main, what you call it, the main body of the bait. So that's what the fish see primarily. Then they see the trailer coming out behind it. So skirts, I used to always want them to be super thick like this. Now, the clearer the water is, I really am starting to get to where I like more thin skirts. And for skipping especially, the thicker the skirt, the worse the bait's going to skip. If you want to really skip something, you pull a bunch of strands out of the back of that jig to where that plastic is literally pretty much exposed, and keep you a flat plastic like that, and it'll skip. Like, it'll skip a whole lot better than something like this is a big rubber jig with a ton of, skirt material right behind it. It's hardly going to skip. This is a very difficult jig to skip right here. A jig is not an easy bait to skip in the first place. But anyways, this is my skipping jig. Same one. This is one I cast. I cast it to rocks. I use this jig for pretty much everything. The only drawback to this jig is this hook is very light wire. So I have actually been skipping under docks, and this will hit a dock post and bend the hook over. So that hook will be bent all the way down where you can't get in a fish's mouth, because I'm skipping with a ton of force. I'm trying to get it way under there, and you hit something and it just folds it over. I mean, that's obviously terrible. So this jig would almost be perfect if it had better paint and a better hook. That's why they need to let me design it. But anyways, that's my skipping jig. I only keep those in green pumpkin and black and blue, and I almost always put either a super chunk like this on it or a speed crawl. That's the only two baits I pretty much use as a trailer. Now, another jig that I don't hardly ever use is these stand-up jigs. And the reason I don't use them is for the same reason. That hook point is almost always right in line with that line tie. Almost always. And I just don't use jigs like that. You lose way too many on it. Now, what these stand-up jig heads are good for, the weight is almost always extremely in front of the skirt. So it makes these baits fall extremely straight down, gives it a ton of action, falls straight, and lands face up. It's a good spotted bass bait, but you're going to hook fish in the lips a lot. You're going to lose them on the first jump a lot. So I don't use these kind of hooks, these kind of jigs, because they almost always have a bad hook gap. Now, one of the hook jigs that I keep in the box, and I use them rarely, this is like a punching jig. It's like a big grass jig. It's for flipping on hydrilla edges, any kind of canopy that you can get through. Any hard stuff, matted stuff, cheese, it's not going to get through it. But For edges, this is like 1.25 ounces. It goes through pretty well. It gets down to the bottom in like deep hydrilla, like you're fishing like 10, 12 foot hydrilla where there's a canopy of soft stuff and you can get under the bottom. This is a good bait for that. Get you some really big bites. Looks like a big bluegill just diving down to the bottom. So basically, this is a jig I rarely use. Always throw it on braid, 65-pound braid, because this is a giant hook, giant jig. You're getting way down in some thick stuff. You have to have that line to get them out. Always use at least a 7'6" rod on this. Maybe you should go up to like a 7'10", because this is a heavy bait, heavy presentation. Use it for the same thing you'd use like a punching bait for, a punching rod for. So basically, another thing is, these are super old, is a hair jig. These is like a regular deer hair jig. Whenever the water's cold, this is an absolute killer. You fish it super slow on these bluffs, and it takes forever to fall, and something about it, the fish just eat it up in the wintertime. Now, I haven't thrown it in a couple years, because I've usually try to find muddier water, and always, and in the winter there's usually a lot of muddy water, but when the water's clear, you can go down to some of these crystal clear waters and throw this and absolutely just destroy tons of numbers, even in the wintertime. So that's a jig. This jig is super old, haven't thrown in years, but it is something I always keep in the box during the wintertime. Let's see. Now this is a jig that I actually poured, and you can see, here's just another example of the hook point. You can see the hook point is clear of the line tie, but it's not enough. So basically, when you set the hook, this line tie is going to run out that fish's mouth and be digging on top, and then come out, you're going to hook these fish in the lips. And that is the main issue with jig fishing. You do not want to hook these fish in the lips, because that's going to cause you to lose them first jump. And everybody's done it. You're under a dock, 8 foot of water, set the hook, fish comes up, tail walks, first time, throws a jig right back at you. Happens a ton if you use the wrong jig. If you use a jig like this though, it's not going to happen near as much, I promise you. This is a big deal. I want to design one like this, but I haven't found a company that will let me yet. Now, one big debate is, in the wintertime, do you need rubber skirted jigs or not? And from what I've found, the answer is no. Now, I use them in the winter because the bait's just so big and bulky and falls slow. So I do get some really big bites on a rubber skirted jig in the winter, but I still seem to catch more numbers on a regular silicone skirted jig with some kind of do-nothing trailer like this Super Chunk. Now, this right here is the Zoom Big Salty. This is the jig I've been throwing literally this week, and it's a black and blue rubber skirted jig. I've been struggling with it. Haven't been hardly getting any bites at all. My girlfriend's dad was actually throwing this exact jig behind me while I was flipping this, and he got more bites than me throwing this jig the other day, even in stained water. So rubber, kind of overrated in my opinion, as most things are. I don't think there's any laws in fishing. You can use literally anything, anytime, and catch fish. But rubber skirted jigs look good, and I still use them in the winter, but you don't gotta have them for sure. Now, as far as trailers go, swim jigs, I only pretty much throw something like a rage crawl or a swim bait. Keep it super simple. I match the colors. I'd put a white rage crawl in here, a white menace, or either a white caffeine shad or something like that. Just something that's not a caffeine shad, but something that, like a swimming fluke or like a 3.8 inch Kitech, any kind of paddle tail swim bait on back, or something that you can reel and has a ton of action like a rage crawl. For flipping in a rubber skirted jig, I never put a trailer on that has any action. I always put something on like a Big Salty or a Super Chunk, because I'm always doing a rubber skirted jig in cold water. So I put something like this on that has almost no action, get a ton of bites on it. It's really good presentation. And I think that is about it. Hope I didn't forget anything. I really tried to simplify. One thing I will talk about is a wood jig, a flipping wood jig. You want to go up in weight. So if you're flipping wood with like a 1/2 ounce Texas rig, you're going to need at least a 3/4 ounce jig to make the same presentations, because the jig gets hung up a ton trying to go in and out of wood. It just gets, it just hits stuff and just lays there. It doesn't really get like snagged. Even though it does get snagged more on a Texas rig, it's just hard to get it to penetrate the cover. So if you're going to flip wood, you want to go up in size for sure. If you're using a 1/2 ounce Texas rig to get in these trees, go to a 3/4 or a 1 ounce jig to get it down there the same way. So other than that, hope I told y'all everything you need to know about jigs. I will see y'all next time.